John Lennon. By December 1980, John Lennon had stepped back into the spotlight. The former Beatle, then 40 years old, had spent years out of the public eye, raising his young son and stepping back from music almost entirely. And he had just returned with a new album recorded alongside his wife, Yoko Ono. He lived at the Dakota, a grand apartment building on Manhattan's Upper West Side, where he was often seen coming and going and was generous with the fans who waited outside for a glimpse of him. One of those fans was Mark David Chapman, a 25-year-old former security guard who had traveled from Hawaii. As a teenager, he had idolized the Beatles, but over time his admiration curdled into resentment, fueled by Lennon's wealth and fame and by a growing fixation on the novel The Catcher in the Rye, whose themes he twisted into a private justification for what he was planning. How does someone cross the line from devotion to a decision to harm the very person they once admired? In Chapman's case, the descent took months. He planned the killing over a long stretch, even traveling to New York earlier that autumn before returning home, only to come back again in early December. He would later tell a parole board that Lennon had not been his only possible target, naming other famous figures, among them a fellow musician and other well-known entertainers, that he had carefully weighed before settling on the man at the Dakota. On the evening of the 8th of December, 1980, the two crossed paths in a way that now feels almost unbearable to picture. As Lennon left for a recording session, he paused to autograph a copy of his new album for Chapman, a moment captured on film by an amateur photographer who happened to be standing nearby. Lennon, with no idea who he was dealing with, had just signed his name for the man who intended to end his life. Chapman lingered outside the building for hours, waiting in the cold. When Lennon and Ono returned late that night, just before 11, Chapman opened fire as the couple walked toward the entrance, striking Lennon several times. Lennon was rushed to a nearby hospital but could not be saved, and was pronounced dead a short time after he arrived. What kind of person stays behind after an act like that? Chapman did not run. He remained at the scene, calmly reading the same novel he had carried with him all day, and was still standing there when officers arrived to arrest him. There was no chase and no manhunt, only a man calmly waiting to be taken into custody for killing one of the most famous musicians who had ever lived. In 1981, Chapman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life. The plea spared the city a lengthy trial, but it guaranteed that the question of his release would return again and again for decades to come, and it has. Chapman became eligible for parole in the year 2000, and he has been turned down every single time he has come up for review since. After a hearing in the summer of 2025, he was denied parole for the 14th time, and his next opportunity is not even scheduled until early 2027. Why does a case from more than 4 decades ago still command such close attention? Yoko Ono has written to the board repeatedly over the years, opposing his release and citing her fears for herself and for both of Lennon's sons. And the board has sided with her every time the question has come up. Lennon's memorial in Central Park, which opened in 1985, still draws crowds of mourners every December, who gather there to mark the date and to remember the music he left behind for the world. The man who killed him remains behind bars to this day, held at the Green Haven Correctional Facility, more than 4 decades after the night he waited outside the Dakota, with a freshly signed copy of an album in one hand and a weapon in the other. Lennon's killer had followed him to his own front door, a place that almost anyone could find. The next case shows how a fan could reach a target who had carefully kept her own home address private, using a method that, at the time, happened to be entirely legal. Rebecca Schaeffer. Rebecca Schaeffer was a young actress whose career was just taking off. At 21, She had moved from modeling into television, earning a starring role on a popular sitcom. And on the very morning of her death, she was preparing to audition for a part in The Godfather Part 3, waiting at home for the script to be delivered. She was talented, ambitious, and by every account, warm and kind to the people around her. One of the strangers watching her from afar was Robert Bardo, a 19-year-old fast food worker from Arizona with a troubled past. After seeing Schaefer on television, he became fixated on her, writing her letters and twice trying to reach her on set. He had even fixated on and pursued another public figure before turning his full attention to the young actress on his television screen. How could a fan who had never met her find his way to her front door? The answer exposed a frightening gap in the law. At the time, motor vehicle records could be obtained by almost anyone willing to pay, and Bardo hired a private investigator for a fee of around $250 to track down her home address through those records. The method was not his own invention. It had been used in an earlier attack on another actress, and Bardo simply followed the same path to reach Schaefer. On the 18th of July, 1989, Bardo traveled from Arizona to her apartment in West Hollywood. When Schaefer answered the door, the two spoke briefly. She was polite to him, gave him an autographed photo, and asked him not to come back again. He left, but the rejection seemed only to harden something inside him. What turns a quiet exchange at a doorway into a deadly return an hour later? About an hour after he first walked away, Bardo came back and shot Schaefer once as she stood in her own doorway. She died soon afterward. He then fled back to Arizona, where he was arrested the following day after being spotted darting through traffic on a busy interstate, his strange behavior drawing the attention of police who had no idea what he had just done. The case was handled by a prosecutor who would later become a household name during a far larger trial, and Bardo chose to be tried by a judge rather than by a jury. In October 1991, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the woman whose career had been so full of promise, the man who ended it would never walk free. But the impact of her death reached far beyond the courtroom. Schaefer's murder became a turning point in how the country thought about stalking and privacy. Her killing directly inspired California's first anti-stalking law, passed in 1990, which became a model for similar statutes across the United States. It also helped drive a federal law restricting public access to the kind of motor vehicle records that had led Bardo straight to her door, finally closing the loophole that had made her so easy for a stranger to find. So what became of the man who exploited that loophole? Bardo has remained in prison ever since, with no prospect of release. Years into his sentence, he was stabbed by another inmate and survived the attack, then went on serving the same life term he had been given for taking Schaefer's life. The fan who had once filled notebooks with thoughts of a young actress he had never truly known would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The details that emerged at trial laid bare how easily it had all been done. A private investigator testified that he had located Schaefer using little more than her name and date of birth. And the fee Bardo had paid for that work was strikingly small, just a few $100s to buy the whereabouts of a woman who believed her home was her own private space. The federal law that followed, passed in 1994, was written specifically to stop that kind of access from ever being so simple again. Schaefer's killer was a stranger who forced his way into her life from the outside. The next case turns that idea completely on its head, with a danger that came not from a faceless admirer, but from someone the star knew well and had trusted closely for years. Selena Quintanilla. Selena Quintanilla was the brightest star in Tejano music. Born in a small town in Texas, she had risen with her family band to become the genre's defining voice, the first woman in Tejano music to win a Grammy, and a beloved figure right across the Latino world. At 23, she was building a fashion business and recording an English-language album meant to carry her to an even wider audience. The danger in her life did not come from a stranger in a crowd. It came from a woman she trusted. Yolanda Saldivar, a registered nurse, had founded Selena's fan club in 1991 and later went on to manage the singer's boutiques, working her way deep into the inner circle and slowly earning the confidence of the whole family. What happens when the person running your fan club turns out to be stealing from you? That was the question the Quintanilla family began asking in early 1995. Fans had complained about orders they never received, and an internal review found that Saldivar had been taking money using forged checks from both the fan club and the boutiques. The amount was eventually estimated at around $30,000, and the discovery put both Saldivar's position and her whole relationship with Selena in serious jeopardy. On the 31st of March, 1995, Saldivar arranged to meet Selena at a motel in Corpus Christi, where the singer hoped at last to recover the missing financial records. The meeting turned tense as Selena pressed her for answers about the missing money and the paperwork that would explain it. How does a dispute over records end in a singer's death? It happened in an instant. Saldivar shot Selena once as the confrontation reached its peak. Gravely wounded, Selena still ran toward the motel lobby for help, and with some of her final words, she named the woman who had shot her and the exact room number where it had happened. She was rushed to a nearby hospital but could not be saved, and was pronounced dead in the early afternoon. She was only 23 years old. Saldivar did not surrender at once. She locked herself inside a pickup truck in the motel parking lot and held police at bay for roughly 9.5 hours in a tense standoff, at times threatening to harm herself, before she at last gave herself up. What does justice look like for the killing of a beloved star? In October 1995, Saldivar was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after a full 30 years had passed behind bars. For 3 decades, that distant date hung over the case as the family rebuilt their lives around the memory of the daughter they had lost. That date finally arrived in 2025. In March of that year, Saldivar came up for parole for the first time and was denied. The parole board pointed to the nature of the crime, describing it as carrying elements of brutality and a conscious disregard for life that, in its view, made her a continuing risk. Her next review was set for several years in the future. And Selena's family said publicly that they were grateful the board had chosen to keep her where she was. How did a young singer become an even larger figure in death than she had been in life? Selena never stopped growing in stature after her death. A film about her life introduced her story to millions and helped launch the career of the young actress who played her. Her crossover album reached the very top of the national charts not long after she died, and her home state set aside a day each year in her honor. The girl from a small Texas town became a permanent icon. Her music still played and celebrated across generations who never had the chance to see her perform live. The woman who killed her remains behind bars. More than 30 years after a dispute over missing fan club orders and forged checks ended a singer's life. And after a standoff in a motel parking lot brought the whole nation's attention to a single room number. Selena's killer had been welcomed into the family business and treated as one of their own. The next case returns to the parasocial obsession of a fan the artist had never truly met, striking in a moment that was supposed to be a celebration. Christina Grimmie. Christina Grimmie had built her career one video at a time. A singer from New Jersey, She had grown a devoted following by posting covers online, then reached a national audience as a standout contestant on a popular televised singing competition, where she finished near the very top of her particular season. At 22, she was a rising pop star, known just as much for her warmth and her genuine openness with fans as for the power of her voice. That openness was something a man named Kevin Loibl came to see in a distorted way. A 27-year-old store employee from Florida, Loibl lived in near total isolation and had developed an intense obsession with Grimmy over the previous year, gradually convincing himself that the two of them were somehow meant to be together. How does a one-sided fixation grow into something a person acts on? In Loibl's case, it consumed his daily life. According to the one person he was close to, he spent most of his waking hours watching her videos and tracking her every move across social media. He went so far as to reshape his own appearance through a string of cosmetic procedures, from corrective eye surgery to dental work, hair restoration, and weight loss, all in the belief it would make him more appealing to her. And in the days before he acted, he legally purchased 2 handguns. On the 10th of June, 2016, Grimmy performed at a venue in Orlando and then stayed afterward to greet fans, signing autographs and offering hugs to the people who had lined up to see her. It was exactly the kind of generous, open gesture she had become known for. And it was that very closeness with her fans that Loibl would go on to exploit. What should have been one of the safest moments imaginable became the most dangerous. As Grimmy opened her arms to greet him, Loibl shot her. Her brother, Marcus, who was standing nearby, immediately tackled the attacker in a desperate attempt to stop him from doing any more harm. Loibl broke free and then took his own life there at the scene. Grimmy, gravely wounded, could not be saved despite the efforts to reach her. And a young woman beloved by so many people was gone in a matter of moments. Because the man responsible had died, there would never be a trial to answer the questions her family was left with. Investigators worked hard to understand what had driven him, but his exact motive was never fully established, in part because the personal devices that might have explained his thinking yielded almost nothing of any use. What was clear was the depth of the obsession that had taken over his life. A one-sided fixation on a person who had no idea he existed beyond being one anonymous face among many thousands of admirers. Could anything have been done to keep her safe that night? That question drove a painful reckoning over security at smaller venues. The event had included bag checks at the door, but no metal detectors and no pat-downs, and Loibl had passed through carrying both handguns and a knife without ever being stopped. Grimmy's family later pursued a wrongful death claim against the concert promoter and the venue, arguing the security had been inadequate to keep her safe. Though after a stretch of legal back and forth, they ultimately chose to withdraw the case in 2019. In the aftermath, many smaller shows and gatherings tightened their security, a shift some in the industry came to call the Grimmy effect. Events that had once felt informal and open began adding metal detectors and pat-downs of the kind that had been missing the night she was attacked, changing how artists and fans were allowed to meet at venues across the country. Her family also created a foundation in her name, launched in 2017, dedicated to supporting people affected by gun violence and by breast cancer. It kept her name attached to ongoing work rather than only to the night she was taken, and gave the fans who had followed her since her earliest online videos a place to direct their grief in the years that followed. Grimmy was attacked at a gathering meant to thank the very people who supported her. The next case moves directly onto the stage itself, where a performer was targeted in front of a live crowd by a man who was lost completely in his own delusion. Dimebag. Daryl Abbott. Daryl Abbott, known to fans as Dimebag Daryl, was one of the most admired guitarists in heavy metal. With his brother, he had co-founded Pantera, a band whose heavy, aggressive sound helped define an entire style of metal and earned him a lasting place among the most celebrated guitar players of his generation. After Pantera split apart, the brothers formed a new group called Damage Plan and returned to the road, playing the smaller clubs where their fans could get close. In the crowd at one of those clubs was Nathan Gale, a 25-year-old former Marine from Ohio who suffered from severe mental illness. Gale was a Pantera fan, but his thinking had long been twisted by severe paranoid delusions. According to personal writings discovered afterward, he had come to believe that the band could somehow read his mind, that they were stealing his thoughts, and that they were privately mocking him for it. How do you guard against a threat no one can see coming? That was the tragedy of what unfolded. Gale had already caused trouble at an earlier Damage Plan show months before, but nothing about him had marked him as capable of what came next. On the 8th of December, 2004, by a chilling coincidence, the very same date Lennon had been killed years before, Gale climbed a fence outside a club in Columbus, Ohio, and made his way inside just as Damage Plan were beginning their set. Moments into the performance, he rushed the stage. In front of a stunned crowd, Gale shot Abbott repeatedly as the band played, killing the guitarist almost instantly. The attack did not stop there. Gale went on to take the lives of 3 other people, among them the venue's head of security, a club employee, and a fan who had rushed forward to try to help, before seizing a member of the crew as a hostage on the stage. How does something like this end? It ended when police arrived within minutes. An officer named James Niggemeyer made his way through a side entrance into the chaos and with a single shot stopped Gale before he could harm anyone else. The officer was later reviewed as a matter of routine and cleared of any wrongdoing, though he carried the weight of that night with him for a long time afterward, eventually retiring while living with lasting trauma from what he had seen. Because the attacker died at the scene, there was no trial and no testimony to fully explain his actions. What investigators were left with were the fragments of Gale's delusions, pieced together from his own writings, all of which pointed to a mind unraveling under the grip of paranoia. There was no rational grievance and no dispute over money, only a fixation that had fastened itself to a band and to the man at its center. So how was Abbott remembered by those he left behind? He was buried in Texas, sent off with an outpouring of tributes from across the music world, including a casket donated by a famous rock legend and a famous guitar placed inside it by another well-known player. He had been known not as a distant star, but as a warm, approachable figure who genuinely enjoyed meeting the people who came to his shows, which made the manner of his death all the harder for his fans to absorb. His brother, who had played beside him for their entire careers and co-founded the band with him, never fully recovered from the loss and spoke bitterly about the climate that had surrounded the band in its final years. When he himself died years later, he was buried next to Dimebag, reuniting the 2 brothers who had built something remarkable together from the very beginning. The club where it happened, a long-running venue called the Alrosa Villa, was eventually torn down in 2021, erasing the physical site of the tragedy. Years later, the surviving members of Pantera regrouped with new players and returned to the stage in 2022, performing the songs Abbott had helped write to enormous crowds, a homecoming he never lived to see. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Abbott was targeted on the stage where he felt most at home, by a man no one could have reasoned with. The next case carries the story onto a different kind of stage, a football pitch, where a single mistake in a major match set off a chain of events that would cost a national hero his life. Andrés Escobar. Andrés Escobar was one of the most respected footballers Colombia had ever produced. A graceful defender known as the gentleman for his clean, composed style of play, he had helped his club win a major continental title and had become a leader of the national team. At 27, he was admired across the country and was reportedly planning to marry later that year. It is important to say plainly that the popular label so often attached to his death does not quite fit. Escobar is often listed among stars killed by a fan, but the man who shot him was a bodyguard tied to cartel-linked gambling figures, and the killing is widely understood as connected to enormous betting losses rather than ordinary fandom. A former national team coach even argued that the murder had little to do with football at all, calling it a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time in a violent era. So how did a defender become a target at all? It began with a single mistake on the biggest stage in the sport. At the 1994 World Cup, Escobar turned the ball into his own net during a 2-1 loss to the host nation. An own goal that helped knock a highly fancied Colombia out of the tournament far earlier than anyone had expected them to fall. He returned home to a country reeling with disappointment and in some corners with open anger over an exit that had stunned a nation expecting far more. Days later, the worst of that anger found him. On the 2nd of July, 1994, outside a nightclub in Medellin, Escobar became caught up in an argument with people connected to the gambling world. A driver for those figures, Humberto Castro Muñoz, shot him several times, and witnesses reported that the gunman cruelly shouted in mockery of the own goal with each shot that he fired. Escobar died from his wounds, struck down not by a stranger in a stadium, but by a man with deep ties to the city's criminal underworld. How does a country even begin to grieve a hero lost this way? Colombia mourned on an enormous scale. More than 120,000 people attended his funeral, a vast sea of mourners that spoke to just how deeply he had been loved by his country. Years later, the city unveiled a statue in his honor, and fans still carry his image into stadiums to this day, refusing to let his memory fade with the passing years. The man who killed him did face justice, though many felt it fell well short. Castro Muñoz was convicted and originally sentenced to more than 40 years in prison, a term that was later cut by more than half. And in the end, he was released after serving only about 11 years for what was described as good behavior. The gambling figures believed to be behind the dispute were investigated, but were ultimately never charged in connection with the killing, spending only a stretch of months in custody before walking free. Why does this case still resurface decades after the shots were fired? Part of the reason is that its loose ends have never fully closed. The story was retold in a widely watched documentary that examined how the worlds of football and organized crime had collided in that era, drawing a direct line between Escobar's death and the larger violence gripping Medellin at the time. And in a striking recent turn, in early 2026, the Colombian president announced that one of the men long linked to the murder, Santiago Galón Henao, had himself been shot dead in a restaurant in Mexico, reopening old wounds and old questions all at once. Before his death, Escobar had been a cornerstone of a golden era for Colombian football, having helped his club lift a major continental trophy at the end of the 1980s, and anchoring a national side that had gone into the tournament among the favorites. That contrast between the heights he had reached and the squalid circumstances of his killing is part of why his name still carries such weight in Colombia today. Escobar's death was tangled up with gambling and the cartels, far removed from any ordinary admirer. The next case is even harder to pin down: another footballer who collapsed after a match, in a death that, to this day, has never been fully explained or answered for. Albert Ebose Bojongo. Albert Ebose was a striker with everything ahead of him. a Cameroonian forward who had moved to Algeria to play for the club JS Kabylie. He had finished the previous season as the top scorer in the country's top division, and at 24, he looked like a player on the rise. Then, on a single afternoon at his own stadium, his life ended in circumstances that remain bitterly disputed to this very day. This is the most uncertain case on our entire list, and it deserves to be treated that way. Ebose died after sustaining a head injury as he left the pitch following his club's home loss, a match in which he had actually scored his team's only goal. Yet the cause of his death has never been settled, and no one has ever been charged, which means the familiar label of a player killed by a fan is, in his case, far from established fact. So what actually happened that day? From the very start, the accounts pulled sharply in different directions. Algerian authorities said Ebose had been struck by a sharp object thrown from the stands, with a government minister even specifying that the object had been a sharp piece of slate hurled from the crowd. His own club's president, meanwhile, initially suggested that the player had simply suffered a heart attack. But an independent autopsy, commissioned by Ebose's family and carried out by a Cameroonian pathologist, told a different story altogether. What did that second examination find? According to the family's pathologist, Ebose's injuries looked less like the result of a single thrown object and more like the aftermath of a sustained physical assault. He described a skull injury, a dislocated shoulder, and other wounds he believed were not consistent with one projectile thrown from the stands. And he pointed out that footage appeared to show Ebose walking off the field without the kind of visible injury such a strike would have caused. The flat contradiction between the official account and the family's own findings has never once been resolved. In the years since, the path to answers has only grown more tangled. Algerian officials announced a judicial inquiry into the death, but its results were never made public and no charges ever followed from it. The continental football authorities first banned the club from their competitions for 2 seasons, only for that ban to be overturned on appeal on procedural grounds, after a tribunal found the club had not properly been given a chance to be heard. The Football Federation and the government reportedly paid Ebose's family a sum of $100,000 in compensation, and a fair play trophy was later named in his memory. Through it all, his father held firmly to one position, insisting his son had been the victim of a killing rather than an accident or an illness. Could the full truth ever come to light? That question took on new weight in recent years. A French sports journalist named Christophe Glizes, who had been investigating Ebose's death and writing a book about the club, was arrested in Algeria in 2024 and accused of offenses tied to national security, charges that press freedom groups linked to his reporting contacts rather than to any real wrongdoing. In 2025, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison, a heavy sentence that was then upheld on appeal at the end of that very year. As of the middle of 2026, that journalist remained behind bars while major press freedom organizations, the French president, who publicly called the verdict unjust, and even football's world governing body campaigned for his release. The sport's governing body went so far as to reserve an empty seat for him at the 2026 World Cup, a quiet but pointed protest on the biggest stage the game has to offer. More than a decade after Ebose collapsed leaving the pitch, the basic facts of his death are still contested. The official account of a thrown object and the family's account of an assault have never been reconciled, and no one has stood trial, while the journalist who pressed hardest for real answers now sits in a prison cell far from his home. Ebose's death remains unresolved, with no one ever held to account for it. The next case turns away from the stadium and back toward the world of film, to a fan whose obsession turned violent, though this time the person targeted lived to tell the story. Teresa Saldana. Teresa Saldana was a rising actress in the early 1980s, known for her work in acclaimed films like Raging Bull, and later for a long-running television role that would go on to earn her an award nomination. Unlike most of the others on this list, her story does not end in death at the hands of an obsessed fan. She survived the attack, and what she chose to do afterward changed how an entire country thought about the crime of stalking. The danger came from a man named Arthur Jackson, a drifter from Aberdeen, Scotland, who had become fixated on Saldana after seeing her on screen and had traveled a long way with the express intention of harming her. Jackson hired a private investigator who obtained the unlisted phone number of Saldana's mother, then posed as an assistant to the director Martin Scorsese in order to trick the family into revealing exactly where the actress lived. He saw himself, chillingly, as a kind of benevolent figure on a mission, convinced in his delusion that what he was planning was somehow an act of kindness rather than violence. How does a stranger with a delusion turn into a threat at someone's front door? In Saldana's case, it happened in broad daylight. On the 15th of March, 1982, in the middle of the morning, Jackson approached her outside her West Hollywood home and attacked her with a hunting knife, wounding her so severely that the blade itself bent from the force. Many people were nearby and witnessed what was happening. Yet most stood frozen in place as it unfolded, unsure of what to do. What saved her was the courage of one stranger. A delivery man named Jeff Fenn, working nearby, heard Saldana's screams, rushed toward the commotion, and physically subdued Jackson, stopping the attack and almost certainly saving her life. Without his sudden and selfless intervention, the outcome would almost certainly have been fatal. Saldana was rushed straight into emergency surgery and faced a hospital stay that stretched on for months. But she pulled through when so easily she might not have survived at all. There is a haunting detail that links her ordeal to another case on this list. The very method Jackson had used, hiring an investigator to dig out a private address, later inspired the man who stalked and killed the actress Rebecca Schaeffer in the very same part of Los Angeles some years afterward. The same kind of loophole that had endangered Saldana would go on to cost another young woman her life entirely. A grim thread quietly connecting the two cases across the years. So what happened to the man who attacked her? Jackson was convicted of attempted murder and served nearly 14 years. His time behind bars extended in part because he continued to send threats toward Saldana and the man who had rescued her. Even from his prison cell. He was later extradited to face an old murder charge in Britain, found not criminally responsible by reason of his mental state, and committed indefinitely to a psychiatric hospital, where he died years later, in 2004. Could anything good come out of such a brutal attack? Remarkably, Saldana made sure that it did. Rather than retreat from public life, she founded an advocacy group for victims of violent crime and threw herself into pushing for new laws, helping to drive the very same anti-stalking and privacy protections that her own ordeal had exposed as desperately overdue. She wrote a memoir about her long recovery and even played herself in a television film that recreated the attack, turning her own trauma into a genuine tool to help others find their way through theirs. She also rebuilt the career that had nearly been taken from her, returning to television and earning a Golden Globe nomination for her starring role on a long-running crime drama. And she married and raised a daughter in the years that followed. Saldana died in 2016 at the age of 61, after being hospitalized with pneumonia, having spent decades as one of the most prominent and respected voices for crime victims anywhere in the country. Teresa Saldana survived and spent the rest of her life fighting on behalf of other victims. The final case echoes hers decades later and on the other side of the world, where another young performer lived through a frighteningly similar ordeal and, in surviving it, forced her own country to change its laws. Mayu Tomita. Mayu Tomita was a young Japanese performer building a career as a singer and actress, appearing on television and at live events while still studying at university as a college student. At 20, she was part of the close, fan-facing world of Japanese idols, a world built on personal connection with supporters, where artists routinely meet the very people who follow them. Like Teresa Saldana before her, she survived a violent attack, and her case would go on to push an entire nation to rethink how it protects people from stalkers who refuse to be told no. The threat came from a fan named Tomohiro Iwazaki, who had grown deeply obsessed with her. He sent her a steady stream of messages along with gifts, including books and a watch. And when Tomita politely returned the watch to him, his admiration curdled almost overnight into hostility. He flooded her social media with hundreds of angry posts, and she blocked him and went to the police, telling them she was afraid. Here is the part of this whole story that is perhaps hardest to accept. Tomita did not stay silent and then simply hope the danger would pass on its own. 12 full days before she was attacked, she reported Iwazaki to the police, gave them his name and his details, and told them she feared she might be killed. The police did not act on the report, judging that his online messages did not amount to an immediate threat to her. The warning signs were all there, in writing, set down in an official complaint, and still nothing meaningful was done to protect her. What happened on the day of the attack itself only made that failure worse. On the 21st of May, 2016, outside a concert venue in the Tokyo suburb of Koganai, Iwazaki confronted Tomita and attacked her with a knife, wounding her many times over before bystanders who heard her desperate cries finally called for help, and he was arrested right there at the scene of the attack. Earlier that same day, when Tomita had called the police out of fear for her safety, a dispatcher had sent officers to her home rather than tracing where she actually was at that moment, leaving her without protection at the very moment she needed it most. How does a person even begin to come back from an attack like that? Tomita's injuries were severe and life-threatening. She went into cardiac arrest and fell into a coma, regaining consciousness only about 2 weeks after the attack. She was hospitalized for around 4 months and survived without damage to her vital organs. But she was left with lasting harm, including partial blindness in one eye and difficulty using the fingers of one hand, along with deep and persistent trauma that still shapes her life today. The man who had attacked her was brought to court the following year. Iwazaki pleaded guilty to attempted murder, and the judge described the attack as one that clearly carried an intent to kill, handing down a sentence of 14 years and 6 months in prison, though prosecutors had pushed for an even longer term. During the proceedings, he was removed from the courtroom altogether for shouting at Tomita as she tried to give her own account of what he had done to her. Did her suffering at least lead to change? In some meaningful ways, it did. The police issued a formal public apology for failing to protect her, admitting they should have done more. And at the end of 2016, her case helped push Japan to revise its national anti-stalking laws to clearly cover online harassment and cyber-stalking, closing the exact gap that had left her exposed. She later filed a lawsuit against the authorities and her former management, arguing that the attack could have been prevented, a case that was finally settled years afterward. In the years since, Tomita has spoken about living quietly with the trauma she still carries, and she eventually wrote a memoir setting out what had happened to her in her own words, in the hope that it might spare other people the same fate. Her lawsuit against the authorities and her former management was finally settled in 2025, nearly a decade after the attack. She continues to urge the authorities to treat stalking complaints seriously, pointing to her own case as stark proof of how much can be lost when those warnings are allowed to go unheard. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.